You are listening to the Wildlife Photography Podcast with Rob Reed and Josh Galicki, bringing together the love of nature and photography. Episode 15, we lose ourselves in the exposure triangle. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Wildlife Photography Podcast with me, Rob Reed, and my co-host Josh Galicki. Hey Josh, good to see you. How's it going?
Hey, Rob. Good to see you. It's been a little while. Going well. Enjoying the fall weather. Things are getting a little cooler here. And yeah, it's going well.
Yeah, I wish they were getting cooler here. We had last weekend, Jen and I went up to Wales, and it was mid-20s, blue sky. It was like summer.
Wow.
It was just incredible. And we kind of went to a bit of a honeypot location. Of course, it was buzzing with people, which isn't really my favorite thing. I do like a bit of space, but what can you expect on a Sunday when the weather's really nice? But no, it's remained warm. It's almost like summer. It's been so mild. I mean, we're getting a bit of rain now, but the color hasn't come in yet. The autumn color hasn't come in yet, which is quite. I mean, normally by now there's a really good. There's a really good display, and I always say that in my part of the UK in particular, the first week in November is always the best for the autumn color, but I'm not sure that's going to happen this year because it does look, it does look like it's going to be a bit more muted, and maybe it'll be a little bit later this year, but we'll see. But
yeah, we're a little behind too, actually, although peak color where I'm at on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, it's normally early November, actually, like poison ivy, some of the sumac that turns first. So I'm seeing a little bit of that outside. But then again, in northern Pennsylvania, where I'm originally from, I've checked with friends, and they're like in some places at peak color. So it's kind of interesting where 3.5 hours away, how different it can be from coastal plain to upper in the Allegheny Plateau and some of the upper.
Yeah, but I mean, again, you're as I said, you're coastal, and of course, the UK being sort of fairly mild, being surrounded by by sea and with with a jet stream and obviously all that sort of stuff. Then I mean, we're around about the same sort of time, aren't we? For those sort of colors coming in, and the seasons seem to change at roughly the same sort of time. But talking about autumn color, I've been out photographing trees quite a lot recently.
Oh,
which
awesome.
I've really been enjoying, I have to say. So not necessarily with all that magnificent autumn color yet, but just sort of getting out in woodland and immersing myself in it, and sort of getting myself away from that sort of quick fire bird photography type stuff, which is like spray and pray, and like you come away with about 4,000 images. It's actually nice to come home with about 100 or 150 photographs for a change.
When you find a composition, it's not as exciting, at least for me. Like if I'm walking around and I see a cool mushroom, I'm like, oh, well, there's the mushroom, versus oh, look, a pileated woodpecker just came out, and I'm going to, so there's, but, it's just a whole different form of shooting. I'm with you. I'm going to try to get out in the next couple of weeks for waterfalls and fungi. And, once the color really starts moving around, but
I think you get that sort of instant dopamine hit, don't you, with bird photography, where
you do.
You're seeing things all the time, and there's always something happening, and it's so dynamic. Whereas the sort of pace of life, if you like, is a lot slower with woodland stuff and plants and fungi. And actually, I've really enjoyed it because I've really enjoyed a sort of reconnection with everything and taking a bit of time out. And I just find it so relaxing.
It's very convenient when the landscape decides not to move on you or fly away.
Well, there are benefits. And it's funny because I went out the other day because I had this, woodland and mist and fog goes really well together because it sort of provides that separation to help with the chaos of woodland. And, I was looking at the forecast the other day, and it was saying, yes, there's a promise of mist and fog in the morning. And I thought, great, I'll get out for first light. And of course, I got to I left home and it was foggy. And I got to the location, there was nothing. And I thought, oh, okay, just my luck. Oh, well, I'll, go for a nice walk anyway and see what I can find and just take a few things. And then lo and behold, after this amazing sunrise, this blue sky morning, about half an hour into it, we get all this sort of low cloud just rolls in, and we got this lovely sort of fog. And it was fantastic. yeah, I really
It's
enjoyed
kind of
that.
interesting when that happens too. It happened to me a couple years ago. I was up in Maine, and it was late summer actually, and I was paddling on a small little lake up there looking for loons, and you could just see the fog. And it was midday. You know, the fog came in, and it would look like the Night King from Game of Thrones. It was almost
Yeah,
eerie. You could just watch it come in slowly over the water, and it just engulfs you. It's a really cool experience when that happens.
yeah. No, and you can create some really atmospheric photographs with
Yeah,
that. And trees
smooths
are,
out all the sharp edges in the
yeah,
trees, and it
and trees are so interesting if you get the right angles. And actually, they're quite difficult. They're quite challenging to find decent compositions in. So
yeah.
birds are quite easy in a way because I guess
You
when
know
you
where
get
your
experience,
point of focus for the frame is gonna be,
yeah,
it's the subject, and it's hard with a tree. What part of the tree? How do you do it, going in and out
yeah.
and the angles and
How do you mess with the depth of field? How, what do you want to include? What do you want to exclude? How tight do you go with the composition? How loose do you go with the composition? So all these sorts of factors to take into consideration. So I really enjoyed the challenge. I thought it was great.
yeah.
And I'm not one to be pigeonholed anyway as a photographer. Oh, he's a bird photographer. He does this, he does that. I just enjoy shooting nature basically. And yeah, so I go through these phases. So I'm in a bit of an arboreal phase at the moment, I would say. So yeah, I'm enjoying that. But
Cool.
it's just so good to get out and reconnect with this stuff. But
Yeah.
so anyway, we thought today we'd have a chat about the exposure triangle. So for those who aren't familiar with that term, and I'm sure most of you are listening to this then it's that balance between ISO settings, shutter speed, and aperture to create the exposure you want for the photograph. So that's what we thought we'd have a bit of a deep dive into today. So, I mean, I guess for a place to start, perhaps, would be ISO, because I think that is the area that has been revolutionized the most in recent years with obviously the development of digital technology and more recently the mirrorless cameras and the way that those sensors are now able to cope with those high ISO settings compared to, well, when we go back to the days of film, if you were using anything more than 400, you were struggling. And now look what we've got. And I guess, we've discussed this in some of the other podcasts that we've done, that sort of ISO revolution, if you like, but how that has liberated us as photographers, particularly wildlife photographers, in those sort of low light situations. I guess that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, I think it is. And ISO, when you look at the past couple of years, I mean, I can just go back to my experience. I had a 7D. This was back in 2014, 2015, and I wouldn't go past ISO 800. Now, I mean, anything's really on the table as far as ISO goes. Interesting enough, I'll say when it comes to exposure, I always have controlled my ISO settings manually. I know a lot of people now, they shoot in manual like I do, but ISO is set to auto ISO. So a lot of folks will rely on the camera to determine the ISO based on, the shutter and the aperture settings. And I think people feel more and more confident to do that just because a lot of these newer cameras are so good with ISO. So if something gets bumped up to ISO 8000 or, 10,000 or whatever, or even higher than that, folks are confident they can have a usable image, not just for the sensor and what the cameras can capture, but also you have like DxO Raw and some of these processing softwares where they can handle noise so well. But again, it depends on the camera. If you're dealing with a camera that's a little older, that's still okay too. It's just a matter of figuring out what are the parameters, what are some of the strengths of your gear, and how do you apply that in the field in terms of what you're trying to capture? Because of course
Yeah,
we're talking more. I'm talking more in an action setting if I want to capture something fast moving and maybe
and
not so sharp.
presumably, and I people tend to use that sort of setup, those sorts of settings when they looking for more literal type images. So they're allowing the camera to determine the exposure, and then you are altering the exposure level by using the exposure compensation as opposed to adjusting the manual settings to get the look and feel that you want. I mean, with digital cameras, it's a lot easier, with mirrorless these days, because you're seeing the exposure in real time through the viewfinder. So you are actually seeing what the camera is dictating, if you like, and then you can make those adjustments on the fly. I do use auto ISO quite a lot, but it is generally when I've got an exposure setting in mind and I've dialed in, the exposure compensation that I want the camera to use in that scene. If things are moving around a little bit and the lights coming and going, then perhaps I won't. But it just depends on the situation. But no, I have found that I don't care about ISO anymore. It's got to that point where I'm just not bothered. As you say, I've got images I've shot at 10,000 ISO, and I really haven't got a problem with them. I mean, my default setting, even with the 800E that I shot with, for so many years, my auto ISO setting, my starting point, my default was 1,000 anyway, and then I'd kind of work from there if I wasn't getting enough, or I could get away with less, on the ISO front to get a cleaner shot, but they were always pretty clean depending on the light levels. So yeah, I do shoot, if I get my words out properly, shoot auto ISO a fair amount, as you say, in those sort of action type scenarios where the lighting may change quite quickly and you don't want to be constantly adjusting your settings and then perhaps compromising a shutter speed, for example, or a depth of field setting with the aperture settings, and you just want the ISO to determine the exposure, so those other things are already dialed in and you don't have to worry about them. So that's probably when I would use them.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, I think stylistically, I like some grain at certain times. If you have an animal shaking off, if you have rain, I think adding grain or having, a higher ISO resulting in more grain, that actually adds to the image. Not a lot of people think that way. I think it's sexy to be, okay, smooth as butter, ISO 200, run the noise reduction. And it kind of looks fake to me. I like a little grain in there, so I'm not bothered by it even stylistically.
It's almost like a facelift, isn't it, when it's gone too far?
Yeah, definitely.
Hollywood stars that just look like they're constantly smiling because they.
Yeah, I'm thinking of what's his name with Dolly Parton. Well, she had a bunch of work too.
Yeah,
what was his name? Islands in the Stream. Kenny.
Kenny Rogers.
Kenny Rogers. Yeah, that comes to mind. So, yeah.
But it's a bit. It can get a bit like that. But I get what you mean. It does look a little. You can get too perfect, can't you?
Yeah.
And you lose that. You lose that raw feel and that edge. And we've seen it in wild art, haven't we? When there are some images where the photographers have chosen not to denoise something and use the grain to add that atmosphere, and it works so well sometimes.
Looks great. Not black and white, monochrome stuff.
Yeah,
I think it looks really good.
I mean, when you go back to the days of film and you that film grain is, I think it's much nicer. It's aesthetically more pleasing, I think, the film grain than digital noise.
Yeah,
because they're not the same thing. Digital, when we talk about grainy images, in digital photography, it's digital noise, whereas the grain in film is, it's just got a whole different feel to it. But I guess the connection is made because they produce similar issues. But I just think some images, when you've got that atmosphere that grain produces, I think it's almost a crime to take it away, because you're losing something, you're losing that atmosphere, and life isn't perfect. And sometimes I think we try to be too perfect, and then we lose something, in the interpretation of that photograph by the post-processing process.
I agree. I was photographing, this was I think it might have been last fall, elk, early morning, all misty, foggy, and I did some black and white conversions, and the grain looked incredible. And I ran a noise reduction. I'm like, oh, this looks terrible. Like, why am I even doing this? And I kept the grain. So yeah, I think, controlling ISO manually can also be beneficial. We were just talking about using the auto function and cranking it actually for intended grain. That could really look good stylistically. I mean, speaking of ISO, I did use auto ISO in the past. One of the things that has come out, and again, I'm a Canon shooter, and I think this is probably the same for Nikon, Sony, and the rest, but I have 3 dials now on my cameras, which is a game changer for me. Before I would have 2 dials. So with 3 dials, I can control ISO, aperture, and shutter, each with its own dial. So I do everything on the fly, and it just, the more you do it, of course, it's muscle memory at that point, right? So you can move, but having the 3 dials allows me to control it manually. So I don't shoot auto ISO that much, if any. I've got just everything on the dials now, so I can move things around. And again, the more you do it, it's muscle memory at that point.
Yeah, it's not something I do a lot now. I mean, as I said, I will use it if I've got an action sequence and I want to keep those things dialed in, and I want all my concentration on composition and making sure I capture the right moments. But other than that, I'm with you. I tend to do it on the fly. I know where the buttons are. I know where the dials are, and it's just automatic. And it takes a split second for somebody who's used to the camera, used to doing it, and as you say, it's muscle memory, and you just in there and straight away and making the adjustments on the fly that you need to at the time. So I don't use it a lot, but I think people shouldn't be frightened of using auto ISO and shouldn't get too concerned now about if something comes out at 10,000 ISO. Oh, I can't possibly. I mean, I still see in some of the competitions that I judge, and some of the images that now come into to Wild Art as well, I do still see people that want to try and get away with using that sort of 100 ISO and will compromise the shutter speed or the aperture setting to get there, in the mistaken belief that actually it's going to make a whole load of difference to the end image, because it really isn't. I would challenge people actually to tell too much difference between something shot at 100 ISO and 1,000 now in reasonable light. Low light, I accept, that's a different scenario. But quite honestly, if you're in low light and you're shooting wildlife, very unlikely you're going to be using 100 ISO anyway.
And you're right, it's all in the shadows, right? You're right. It's normally in the shadows where you get or if you underexpose and you brighten it in post, that's where you'll introduce, a lot more noise too. No, that actually makes really good sense. I'm just thinking about some of the other settings, and aperture always fascinates me in setting aperture when it comes to wildlife photography. I'll say this, most people, the general assumption is shoot wide open. If you have an f4 lens, you shoot at f4. If you have an f2.8 lens, you shoot at f2.8. And I've been looking at some EXIF data. I was looking at, actually, I got the Bird Photographer of the Year book recently, and the Wild Art book I was going through not that long ago as well. And I've noticed that a lot of shots, photographers they'll stop down. And, so if somebody's shooting, f8, they're at f4. If they're at f4, then they're at f5.6. Or there'll be, somewhere in between, f4.5 or what have you. And I think I don't know if this is correct or not, but it never bothered me. A lot of people seem to think, and this was the thing years ago, the sweet spot. Okay, well, if you have an f4, stop down to 5.6. That's the sweet spot. Or if you're at f2.8, go to f4, because of course the outer edges of the lens aren't as sharp, and you want to get to the sweet spot. I always shoot I'll never stop down to get to the supposed sweet spot, because at the end of the day, if I'm shooting a bird or a mammal, there's always a little bit of cropping there anyhow, right? And I'd rather get a shallower depth of field if that's what I'm going for, So I do notice that, though. That seems to still be common in the wildlife photography community, that stop down to the sweet spot. Shoot open, but stop down a little bit so you get that sweet spot in the lens. I don't know.
No, I agree. But I mean, when you come to shooting things at, say, 500 mil or 600 mil, when you're using that telephoto or that long prime lens, and you're at f4 and you're shooting something that's 20 meters away, shooting at f4 or f5.6 or f6.3 ain't going to make a hell of a lot of difference to your depth of field in that image. It just really isn't.
Yeah.
If you were at the minimum focal distance of that lens, whole different ball game. Your aperture will have a lot more effect in terms of the depth of field that you're able to create. And at that point, really need to be at f8 plus to get if depth of field is your thing and you want a reasonable depth of field, then that's where you got to be at to get more out of the lens, more out of the subject when it's closer to you. The further it is away, and maybe you're focusing at infinity, ain't going to make a lot of difference.
Yeah, f2.8 for the mountains, it doesn't matter. You're totally right, Robin. I agree. I stop down and I try to really monitor my depth of field when I'm close to an animal versus when I'm further away. When I'm further away, I want to shoot as open as possible. Like if it's, I was shooting white-tailed deer, they were drinking in the cove back here, and I was in a kayak, but all the trees were behind them. The trees could be really distracting if they're in focus. And I don't want to do a lot of softening and filtering in post because I just don't like to spend hours on an image. So I'll shoot them at, I have a lens that's f2. So they're sharp, but everything else is reasonably soft in the background. So I'd rather go wide when I'm at a distance, and when I'm closer is when stopping down is the most important thing. And
so here's the thing. The longer the lens, the closer you are to the subject, the shallower the depth of field will be. The further, the shorter the lens, the further you are away from the subject, the greater the depth of field will be. So I use this, and I use the 200 to 500 a lot for shooting things like plants and sort of larger fungi, that sort of thing, because I like it. If I'm shooting at 500 millimeters and I've got the minimum focal distance between obviously the lens and the subject itself, at 5.6, which is the maximum aperture that I can have with that lens, the depth of field is artistically speaking, I love that because it's so shallow, and it just softens everything else but the thing you really want in focus. And you can also use things like out of focus foliage to add all that sort of the lovely framing and softness around an image and create those effects. So I love it for that. But if I was at infinity, I wouldn't get anything like that sort of depth of field with that lens. It just wouldn't work. I need to be as close as I can be, which I think is why the macro stuff works so well, because you get so close to it. The depth of field aperture is really critical with those lenses to create the image that you want. I mean, if you're shooting at f2.8 with 100 mil, 105 mil macro lens and you're really close to the subject, there ain't much going to be in focus with that. There really isn't. Everything's going to fall away. So you need to be at f11, f16 plus.
But, and we have an underrepresented button on our cameras too, which I should use it more often. I always say the depth of field preview button, which for me it's in the front of the camera, and I don't use it enough. Just to kind of, and of course you can chimp and play around, but if it's an animal and it's there, you might just have one shot at that. So you want to get that right. But there's a lot more nuance. As we're speaking, I'm just thinking there's a lot more nuance to aperture than what most people think. It's just, if whatever my lens is, just shoot wide open because I'm going to get the fastest shutter. Shallower is better. Yeah, that's the case most of the time, but not always. There's more nuance there.
Yeah, but I think think about the distance you are from the subject.
Yeah.
Make that your sort of primary thought, and then work the aperture around that. Because as I said, if you're at infinity anyway, the aperture setting isn't going to make a lot of difference, really, when you look at an image, and particularly if you're looking at it on social media and you can't get really close to it and and zoom in at 100% and study the background versus the subject. You may find that f11 or f8 the lens performs better, but again, you're just not going to see it unless you zoom in right at that sort of 100%, and you are grabbing the magnifying glass again on the print to see the difference. I mean, people go on about it, and you see these reviews online about various lenses and how sharp they are.
The MTF charts,
F8, they're photographing those, and they're saying, well, look at the difference, and this lens is much sharper than that. And you're thinking, well, that's all well and good, but by the time you've processed it, you've added a bit of sharpening, and you've seen it at the size that generally people see it, you are not going to be able to tell the difference.
Yeah. We're not shooting a $20 bill in controlled environments or a toy. I mean, it's not how the real world
we're
works.
not. We're photographing wildlife, and really is that the most important thing about the image? To me, it's about light, it's about composition, That's what it's about.
Yeah.
I guess light and composition.
Yeah, I think for me, sharpness only takes a major precedent if it's like macro or details or feathers or something when you're in close. I think sharpness is more important. But when it comes to composition and you're not in the macro environment, I guess you could make an argument even in macros. In some cases, it's not that important. But yeah, that it totally outweighs everything. It's all about composition.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the sort of photography you like as well. I mean, if you like me, or I like lots of sort of out of focus stuff, I guess. I like things that look like pencil drawings, for example. If you're photographing plants, let's say, or you're using a high key approach with birds or whatever, sharpness isn't my main priority with that. It's the overall feel of the photograph, and actually a bit of softness can actually add things, add to the image, in those circumstances. So I guess the whole thing about you using these sort of three elements to generate the exposure that you want, you've got to think about the end image and what you're trying to produce to sort of get the best out of those settings. So the one that we haven't touched on yet, and the remaining sort of corner of the triangle, if you like, is shutter speed. And I guess that probably is the most dynamic setting of all if we're talking about creating different effects with your images, particularly with wildlife, which can be very fast moving. And if you're photographing a plant, unless it's blowing around wildly in the wind, it's not going to make a lot of difference. But if you're photographing birds in flight, a running cheetah or whatever it might be, then your shutter speed choice is critical to to guide the type of image that you're trying to create. So if you're trying to freeze the action, for example, and a very, very common mistake I see in a lot of the competition images is people underestimate the actual shutter speed that they need to get that subject sharp. And I guess the closer you are to something, the faster it's moving, the faster the shutter speed you will need. And the other factor that people don't take into consideration much, or as much as they should do, is the actual magnification effect that the modern day sensors have had. So if you're going from a 12 megapixel image, I guess, which the sort of cameras that I first started using, through to 45 megapixels, just think how much larger that image is and how much more that magnifies any slight blurring of the subject through a lack of shutter speed. You'll get away with far more with a 11 or 12 megapixel image than you will with a 45 megapixel image, because you can zoom in a lot further, and there's a lot more detail with that.
Yeah, I had that problem with the 5DSR, which was Canon's 50 megapixel. This came out in like 2015 or whatever. I'm not a techie. Was the anti-alias filter, so that it softens images too. And then, again, there was so much more sensitivity where I thought I had my shutter dialed in, and then a lot of my images were softer than what I expected. And it was just due to the resolution changes. And yeah, that's a really good point, Rob.
Yeah, and it is something that's been mentioned by a few people. If you go onto YouTube and sort of other podcasts, I know this is something that has been brought up. But yeah, those anti-aliasing filters, they were a nightmare, actually. I remember that the Nikon D800, you could have the 800 with the filter on it, or the 800E didn't have it, and I got the 800E for that very reason, because I didn't want that softening effect.
Yeah, it was maybe more for landscape photographers, I guess. I'm not sure, but it was a pain in the sense that the raw images were just rendered softer, and then of course you had to sharpen. But no, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a really good point.
But no, so I mean, I guess when we come to taking artistic images, the understanding of shutter speed, I think it really is critical. If I'm looking to freeze something in motion, then my sort of default starting point is probably 1/2500th of a second, and I'll work upwards from there. I mean, I remember a year or so ago, a couple of years ago, maybe, I remember fighting moorhens, where they're a bit like coots. They, raise up and they're, going for it with their feet, and they're just knocking.
Yeah, they can be nasty, right?
Six bells out of each other. And I was at one. I remember it was good light. I remember I was at 1/5000th of a second, and I thought, that'll be enough. And I tell you, those feet were still blurred.
Wow.
At that, and I'm thinking, I was surprised at that. So it's amazing how you can underestimate,
it's
the
about
speed
knowing
that
your
you actually
subject,
need.
right? And how fast, like an eagle, bald eagle, or a great blue heron, I shoot them a lot. 1/500th, I can,
but they're big birds, aren't they?
Bigger birds, slower wing. If it's a songbird, you really have to crank up your shutter speed. So it's knowing the animal, and even I like a bit of motion or a sense of motion. So sometimes when I'll be photographing birds in flight, I'll render it sharp enough using a shutter where the face, the body's in focus, but the wings will have a sense of blur. So it indicates motion, which can add more interest, So there's different ways of approaching it. To your point, Rob, the artistic approach. And that's where it's not always the fastest shutter isn't always the solution. Sometimes slower is better.
And that's probably where you want a bit more aperture as well to actually try and get that head sharp, because we've all seen those shots where the head's pretty sharp and you're panning with the motion, and the wings are blurred because obviously they're moving faster. And so it all depend on the effect that you're trying to go for, and it's only really experience that will tell you, what sort of shutter speed or what area you need to start at and work from there and review the results and work around it with the particular subject. Because as you're saying, herons, swans, geese, that sort of thing, you get away with a slower shutter speed because of the size of the animal and the speed they fly. Whereas if you're looking at a kingfisher, for example, that's a whole different ball game.
Yeah.
We
need Jiri Ribacek. Is it Jiri Ribacek, the Czech photographer? He is the master of slow shutter. We need him
with snow geese in particular.
Yeah, we need him for. I think he was just in Bosque del Apache. I think he's from Czechoslovakia,
that's right.
Czech Republic. I'm dating myself, but he's so good when it comes to slow shutter and the artistic effects of that stuff.
And herring gulls he worked a lot with as well, didn't he?
That's a good subject too.
Yeah, it is.
They're confiding and they'll move around you, and
yeah. I mean, I've experimented with, shutter speeds of, ridiculously slow shutter speeds, like 1/20th of a second, when you're holding a 500mm lens, and it sounds ridiculous, but actually, most of them will be that's a delete button job, but every now and again you'll get an absolute keeper, and it's something so different from the, just freeze the motion standard shot that you see time and time again.
And they're frankly boring after a while. How many birds in flight, it was a big thing as I think when the technology improved, because it's like, oh wow, I can get this bird sharp, right? Okay, great. And everyone thought that was so cool. And they're just a dime a dozen now. I see all these bird in flight shots. Like, okay, great. It's frozen, its wings are up, and it's flying. Big deal. There's no interest there. But so I think, people try to take it to the next level, and that's experimenting with shutter, and which I think is good.
I think if you have the equipment and have a reasonable understanding of photography, as you say, those sorts of bird in flight images are pretty easy.
Yeah.
But it's creating something different that is going to grab attention is the key. And then it's understanding how those exposure elements work together, which is really where this sort of podcast was going, to create the effect that you want. So, if we're talking about, motion blur, it's understanding the subject, understanding the area you need to start with to create the sort of image you're trying to achieve, and then moving the other pieces of the jigsaw into place around the major exposure element. Because I guess when we're talking about photography, it depends what we're shooting, but there's always one of those three elements which is the sort of primary consideration, I think, when we're looking at the exposure of the scene. So with that sort of birds in flight example, then it's shutter speed. If it's a plant where we're looking for some sort of artistic effect, then it's aperture. If you're looking to introduce grain and noise to try and add a bit of atmosphere, then it's ISO.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting. Depending upon the composition and the output that you want, obviously one of the three takes priority. I mean, I was just culling some images from Shetland. I'm still culling from my 45,000 images.
I didn't dare ask, actually, how you're getting on with that.
Yeah, I need a glass of wine each night, and I'm starting to go through. So I'm about halfway there, but I did do a lot of pan blurring for northern fulmars and gannets in flight. Puffins a little bit too. And when I was photographing those, I would intentionally set my shutter, to 1/10th, 1/15th, which means I had to bring my ISO down to as low as possible, 150. And then my aperture I had to, because, I wanted to bring it down as much as possible. I'd raise my aperture. I'd stop down the f/16 or whatever it took. So I'm intentionally going slow for pan blurs. If I want to capture a freeze action, it's just the opposite. I'm wide open. I'm bumping my ISO up, and I want to make sure my shutter is as fast as possible so I could freeze. If it's
so the priority is changing, isn't it, for one of those three? Because the thing is, with those blurry images, you don't really care if you're at f/16 because most of it's out of focus anyway because of the blur. So it doesn't make any odds.
Yeah,
it doesn't make any odds. And actually, as I sort of mentioned earlier, your chances of getting a head sharp or something like that are better at f/16 anyway than at f 5.6 or whatever it might, maximum aperture might be f4 or whatever it might be. So it's really interesting
on the pan blurs. It's just you just keep doing it, and you'll cycle through, and if 1 out of 100 come in, great. It's just part of the game. But
exactly. But isn't it funny that the more experienced you get with photography, the less you actually think about those exposure elements as being important? But actually having this conversation with you actually say, hang on, you do this just by a pure instinct. You don't think about it. But when you start teasing it apart and dissecting it, you go, actually, for somebody who's perhaps less experienced, then this is quite tricky stuff to get your head around to start with. You might, you might be relying on automatic settings quite a lot for the camera. You might be giving it aperture priority, for example, which isn't necessarily going to give you the shutter speed that you want to achieve a sharp bird in flight or a blurry bird in flight, because you're using the wrong priority. You need to.
And that's how I started aperture priority. A lot of people, I think, have, and some people still feel comfortable. They'll adjust through exposure compensation. Where I was reaching limits, we were talking about birds in flight when I was shooting a lot of that stuff. If you had a bird in a bright background, goes down to the mid-tone and things. So, or the bird would be darkened, and so it's you can't really run the exposure compensation on the fly like that, and it was limiting in certain instances. But that's how I started aperture priority. Some people started shutter priority or program mode, and then you eventually get to that point. But once you learn aperture, ISO, and shutter, and that's the foundation of everything. All the other stuff on these cameras where you can do a custom function button and this, it's all secondary. These three, mastering exposure that's what it's all about. Everything else,
I mean, they're the keystones, aren't they, to the whole thing? And I mean, I'm with you. I mean, I used to shoot, and I still do sometimes, aperture priority for the majority of my bird photography. Actually, when I first started, I tell you, the thing that has really revolutionized that for me more than anything is mirrorless, because you see the exposure through the viewfinder. So rather than having to keep looking at the meter and almost intuitively guessing where you need to be with the settings or with the exposure compensation, if you were shooting the standard DSLR, where you couldn't see what that effect was immediately until you reviewed the images afterwards, so you were literally going by intuition. I find that the fact that you can see that exposure through the viewfinder is one of the major game changers actually for me with mirrorless, because it makes that decision-making process much quicker, and you can adjust, literally on the go as you're shooting the thing, as it's moving between those lighting conditions. But sometimes I will use an aperture priority. I don't tend to use shutter priority a lot. Never have done, really.
I do it for pan blurs. That's pretty much it. If sometime, I would do it for pan blurs if I want something really slow, artistic. But I used to play a game when I had DSLRs. How close could I get? I'd normally get in the ballpark. I would just look at a scene and just dial things in and take a shot. And after a while, you get decent. You'll either hit it or you'll get pretty close where you'll just make a few minor adjustments. And then back in the day, there was the Sunny 16 rule, the gray card, all that other stuff. And, you don't have to worry about any of that anymore, thank God. But
no, isn't it amazing how things have moved on so swiftly?
yeah.
Because I mean, did you ever own a light meter?
No.
See, I did.
God.
I actually had a light meter.
Wow.
And you think, well, if you're making light meters now, you're not selling many, are you? Well, not for photography anyway, I wouldn't have thought.
And then when we evolved into DSLR, and it was the histogram, bring up your histogram, get to the right of the histogram, and yeah, there's definitely truth to that. But if you're shooting high key, or I'll shoot a lot of like bright white snowy egrets, great egrets, and they're busy backgrounds, so I underexpose. So you don't, while it's generally true your exposure should get as close as you can to the right of the histogram, that's not always the case. You have to play around with it, make your own style up.
No, it depends on the image that you're trying to create, doesn't it? Because I've said this quite a lot, actually. You touched on it with the sort of low key and the high key. It's a great, that's sort of a great technique to isolate subjects when you have got that busier background. So let's say you are shooting from an elevated position and you're shooting a wading bird, and you can't get that low angle on them to create that out of focus background. So you're going to have a lot of whatever they're standing on or standing in focus and distracting you. I did this with oyster catchers on the beach in Shetland, and I deliberately overexposed them probably by about 2 stops. And then all the sand and the water just loses the detail because you're overexposing it. And therefore it focuses attention on the bird itself. I mean, particularly something like, an oyster catcher with that, that lovely colorful bill. And then you've got the black and the white, which are so contrasty anyway. I mean, they make great subjects for high key, but if you use those types of techniques and then swap it around using low key techniques, if you've got something which is perhaps sort of illuminated by a shaft of light, for example. I've seen a lot of those gannet shots or nesting seabird on cliffs, like we've got a place in the UK called Bempton, which is quite popular, and I've seen people use those sorts of techniques where they just underexpose, so they lose all the background detail, and then they focus all the attention on the bird, which is where it needs to go. So they're using those techniques. But they're understanding, the exposure and understanding how they need to compensate for what the camera wants to tell them to create the image that they want to end up with.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I love high key imagery. I mean, it reminds me of that old Japanese silk art. The low key stuff I think is more inspired from like a lot of European type forms of lighting. The only thing that bothers me, it's a side subject, it's how people process, where if somebody takes an image in flat light, they put a radio filter and they put this fake beam of light coming down, and it's like the light of heaven, and it's just touching the side of the animal. I mean, that's great when it's natural. That's what you want. But, there's so much fakery in the processing on that. And it looks so horrible to me. And it's gotten to be this huge trend. I've been seeing it on Insta for like 2 years now. It's like, when is this going to go away? Please, God, take your beam of light and take it away from you.
Beam of light and be gone with you.
Yeah. It's like,
well, I guess if you keep getting likes and, it's going to perpetuate itself, isn't it? It's a self-perpetuating thing. Sorry if you can hear Sky in the background. She's barking again. She always makes an appearance, doesn't she, on these podcasts? Well, the mic might not have picked it up.
She agrees with me on the light.
Oh, she does. Yeah. She was voicing her opinions on the light of God, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, theory. Oh, crikey. So exposure compensation. Do you use that button a lot, or do you tend to do things completely manually these days?
Yeah, I shoot completely manually, but I pay attention to it. We were just talking about high key is a good example. So if, maybe I'll start +3 on the, based on my when I dial my exposure. And if I'm +3, then I'm like, okay, maybe I need to dial back. Maybe I should be +2, so I pay attention to it in the extremes. Other than that, if it looks good, and I'm happy with, how it looks in the back of the camera, I don't pay too much attention to it.
Yeah. I mean, I used to do it quite a lot, when, before mirrorless, I would use it quite a lot. and I can remember going +4, in some circumstances. It's completely nuts. But sometimes if you're shooting a white bird against a gray sky, for example, and then you just want the hint of that bird, and it just bleeds into the sky, and you want that completely artistic feel. I tell you, +4, as you all know, isn't as ridiculous as it sounds. So yeah, I would use it in those sorts of situations. But I'm with you now. With mirrorless, you see what you're getting anyway through the viewfinder, and it's not redundant, but it beyond me generally using -0.3 as a default setting, because I want to underexpose things just a tad, particularly with birds. If there's any sort of bits of white, I don't want them blowing out. In fact, Sky's coming in. Come on.
And it's even if there's strong backlight and you get late morning sun, strong backlight, what I'll like to do, I'll underexpose maybe by 3 stops, where when you underexpose, you're just then catching all the extreme highlights, and all the midtones and everything else are just black. And that's what you want. You want the silhouetting in the rim light. Oh, I think I see Sky now. There she is.
Yeah. She's coming in. Yes. Well, as people will know if they listen to the podcast often enough, that we tend to shoot these. God, photography on the brain. Record these is what I meant. Late in the evening for me, because of the time difference with the States. So Jennifer's gone to bed, and I think she's after a bit of attention. So she wandered in, and now she's wandered out again. She doesn't like the door being closed. That's what
she wanted to check in on you.
Yeah. So, but no, she's a big part of the podcast now, Sky. with making the sort of vocalizations every time we record. So
we have to get her a mic.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be the same without her now, would it?
This is true.
So what's next for you? What are you up to next?
That's a really good question. Probably fall stuff, waterfalls, fungi. The geese are back. I'm waiting for the swans to come back. I'm starting to see some ducks out back. So I'll definitely have my float blind out, especially come November. Owls will be coming back. Speaking of exposure, we were just talking about exposing technically and versus exposing for your own aesthetic. I know a lot of owl photographers, they shoot owls, at dusk or at night, and they'll underexpose. And when they process the images come out underexposed, and that's by intention. I've seen social media posts where people are like, hey, you should really brighten this. I'm like, you're not getting it. No, this was taken at dusk. It was really dark, and I want to convey that. So I guess for people listening, always shoot for your own aesthetic. It should be less about the technical rules and more about what you want to convey in your composition.
Yeah, exactly. And then use those sort of elements to create what you want. And I'm always one about, with photography, when people talk about rules, it's like, well, what rules? They don't exist for me. I always think that, if you are shooting images that please you, then that's the primary thing. If other people don't agree with you, who cares? In a lot of ways. I think we discussed this when we talked about social media. Perhaps people put too much emphasis on being liked on social media, or those images being liked on social media. And if, it used to happen to me, if I put up an image and I got 150 likes, let's say, which is quite a lot for me, that's great. Oh, that image has done really well, and you're really pleased. And then you put another image up and it gets 30, and you go, oh, well, what was wrong with that picture? Right? What happened? Why didn't they like that? Oh, I don't care.
Yeah.
It's
and nowadays it needs to be a 15-second TikTok or a reel with, a cat falling or some sort of practical joke. I mean, it's just,
what you're doing a silly dance to a 1970s disco thing, wearing a I don't know, a reindeer outfit or whatever it might.
I've thought a lot about this too, Robin. I'm thinking, why are reels and TikTok so much more popular than just still imagery? And I think it ultimately comes down to, for most people, the layman, when you're looking at a shot, it's just visual sensation. It's one stimulation. It's your eyesight. When you're looking at these quick reels, it's audio and it's visual. So
you don't have to do as much work.
There's another dimension too of stimulation. And I think that's got to be why there's a additional appeal to it. But it's unfortunate, it's what it is.
Do you know what the thing about photography is, and what I really like, and if people have sort of tuned in and watched some of those awards presentations for Wild Art, for example, I will quite often talk about the images that have done well, is that they have this dimension to them which keeps you going back for more. So rather than taking that quick sort of hit from a chocolate bar, for example, it's almost like a gourmet meal that you keep coming back to again and again, because every time you look at it, there's something different to see, or it tells a story, or it's arresting in some way. And I think that for me is so much more than a video, which can captivate your attention much more easily because of there's a lot more going on initially, but actually still has to work a lot harder to get the same attention. And the people that are able to produce images that do that, I think they're the ones that come across with the skills.
Yeah.
And that's why those images do well. So I'm rambling, but
no, I agree.
Hopefully that's come across.
One process is much more literal than the other, meaning video, I think. And it's a hit. It's a dopamine hit. It's really quick. People get stimulated, but there's not as much depth there as a well thought and well composed image that's presented in,
Yeah.
But there's not a lot of those either. It's not like every shot is like that, but it's when you come out with it, you come out with
it. I guess, why do you buy photography books, for example? You don't pick them up, read them once, and then put them back and never look at them again. Or I don't anyway. I mean, I guess there might be some people that do that, but I have them, and I pick them up and I look at them regularly. Probably is the wrong word, but over and over again at certain points when I'm looking for inspiration, or I'm feeling perhaps less enthused about my own photography. I will use them to stimulate my artistic juices, if you like, and get me going again, and looking at what other people do and how they approach it. And it gives me ideas as well, because everybody looks at photography in a different way. I mean, we're going off a completely different tangent from the subject, but who cares? I mean, this is, as people know, this is organic and this is what happens.
We've got lost in the triangle, so we're going to come out.
Yeah, well, I told you we were going to get lost in the exposure triangle.
I like that. That was good.
That's exactly what's happened. So no apologies there. Anyway, I've lost my train of thought, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Oh dear. Anyway, Josh, this has been a really enjoyable discussion as ever.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think next we've got a guest, haven't we?
I think we do. Yeah,
we have got a guest.
We've got a guest lined up, and we've got a bunch more episodes and topics to talk about. So I'm looking forward.
But we'll probably be able to get the next episode out a little quicker than we got this one out. So apologies for the delay. We're trying to pick up the pace a little bit, but it's difficult with everything that's going on. And I've got an important thing coming up at the end of October, so I'm going to be out for like 10 days with that, and we've got Wild Art coming to a conclusion as well, so I've got all that to organize, and all the awards presentations and what have you. So but we the intention is that we do pick up the pace a little bit with these, because it seems to be resonating with people. And so again, if you have any suggestions as to the topics you'd like us to cover, then do put them in the comments, and we will read them. And we have acted on one or two in the past, and done episodes from suggestions. So we'll add it to the list. And if there's somebody in particular you want us to talk to, get a guest on or whatever, and you can persuade them to come on and talk to the two of us, then likewise put that in the comments. But please leave us a rating on if you've enjoyed the episode. Leave any comments that you'd like, hopefully good. But if not, then hey, thick-skinned. And tell us what you like about the podcast, what you don't like about the podcast. Give us any suggestions that you might have. And perhaps share it on your social media platforms and spread the word, because if you've enjoyed this episode, then perhaps there's somebody else out there that would too, and that's what it's all about for us. So so anyway, great to see you, Josh.
Yeah, likewise, Rob. We'll be talking soon.
thanks for the time and the wisdom, and and the chat. And well, we'll see you all again, hopefully. I think within, it's going to have to be, it's a couple of weeks, isn't it? I think we've got this lined up.
I think what did we say, the 25th? So within the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, within the next 2 weeks, and I need to get that episode out before I go away. So I know we're recording it like 2 days before probably a day before I go away, actually. So I'll need to sort of turn that around fairly quickly. So hopefully in a couple of weeks' time, there'll be another episode for you all to enjoy. So we look forward to recording that. And we'll see you all again next time.
Thanks all.
You have been listening to the Wildlife Photography Podcast. If you have enjoyed the content, then please help us to spread the word by sharing a link on your social media platforms, giving us a like, and leaving us a comment. See you all again next time.